I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and I'm grateful that all of you have come on this rainy day. I think we have a wonderful program. We're going to be talking about one of the great figures of Jewish history, one of the great thinkers, one of the great spirits of our people, the Vilna Gaon. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome Eliyahu Stern, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, in that distant capital of learning called New Haven, and also someone you are familiar with, our friend Jeremy Dauber, who is Professor of Yiddish Literature at Columbia University, who was here not long ago to speak about his book on Sholem Aleichem that has recently been published. Eliyahu Stern is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Yale. From 2009 to 2010, he was Junior William Golding Fellow in the Humanities at Brasenose College and the Oriental Institute, University of Oxford. His book, The Genius, Elijah of Vilna and the Making of Modern Judaism, was published by Yale University Press in 2013. He has served as a term member on the Council of Foreign Relations and a consultant to the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, Poland, and is currently a fellow in the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel. Eliyahu Stern was the Tell Fellow at the YIVO Institute in 2004, so this is a homecoming, and we're very proud of that. The genius Elijah of Vilna and the Making of Modern Judaism is the winner of the 2012 Samuel and Ronnie Heyman Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Publication and finalist for the 2013 Sammy Rohr Prize in Jewish Literature. It is on sale, and those of you who care about the continuity of Jewish genius in the next generation should buy a copy. Jeremy Dauber is Professor of Yiddish Literature at Columbia, where he serves as Director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and teaches in the American Studies program. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard, his doctorate from University of Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. His previous books include Demon's Bedroom, Yiddish Literature and Early Modern, and the Early Modern, Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment, and the Birth of Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature. Jeremy Dauber's most recent work, as I said, The Worlds of Sholem Aleichem, The Remarkable Life and Afterlife of the Man Who Created Tevye, was published by Schocken Books, a division of Random House, and was released in October 2013. That too will be on sale after the event. I urge all of you to please fill out the surveys which are to be found in the programs. It's very important for us to hear from you what you like, what you don't like, what you want, what you don't want. We are in the process of continuing to develop our programs at the YIVO Institute, and it's important for us, as it was for YIVO in 1920, to know how we should respond to the larger community. I would like to invite all of you to come to our 88th annual benefit, which will take place Tuesday, November 19th. The price for members is $360. I know it's steep, but you will hear the klezmatics, and you can't get better than that. And you will see the preview of a world-acclaimed video installation by the Hungarian video artist Peter Forgash, which is, I must say, absolutely amazing. It is an astonishing work of art, well worth the $360, which will help support the YIVO Institute. Thank you very much. Jeremy. Oh, yeah.
Jonathan, thank you very much. That was one for those wonderful introductions. Ellie, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure always to get a chance to talk with you, and particularly now to get a chance to talk to you about this book. And I have to start out with a confession about this book, which is that I got a copy of the book in order to prepare for this, and I read it over Rosh Hashanah, and I read it in shul. And I was so engrossed by the book that I missed part of the shofar blowing. That was what happened. So it is a wonderful, wonderful book, and it is wonderful, I think, in three different ways. I mean, it gives an indelible portrait of an individual, of a particular kind of thought, and of a specific kind of world. And those are all things that have influenced down the centuries from his day to ours, and we'll get back to that. But I want to ask you to start by giving a portrait, a little bit of the man in his world, right? What were some of the challenges that you had to undergo in sort of trying to recapture, as you do, I think, very, very well, a particular individual living at a time so distant from us?
So, Vilna in the 18th century, the name Elijah is two parts to his name. There's Elijah of Vilna. So, Vilna, where he comes or he emerges as the great sage that we know about him today. Vilna in the 18th century is a town that's been ravaged by fires and famines. It does have a history of great learning attached to it. It was one of the larger towns in Jewish towns in Eastern Europe. It was the seat of numerous ethnic groups, capitals. But it was a town that by mid-18th century was largely in decline. By the first half of the 18th century was in decline, and slowly becomes to be a larger, bustling economic place. Its Jewish population begins to grow. It goes from roughly having 2,000 Jewish inhabitants all the way by the end of the 18th century to having 10,000 Jewish inhabitants, which those 10,000 would become roughly around 50% of the population of Vilna. So the first thing you have to get into your mind is, imagine living in a town or in an area in which one of every two people you were bumping into was Jewish. That's a very different experience, right? It's like the difference between living in certain parts of New York or of Los Angeles or Chicago, or living in a place like Buffalo, New York, where I grew up. It's a very different kind of experience when you're around people who speak a similar language than you, when you don't have the pressures of conforming. So Elijah Vilna emerges in this location with a growing Jewish population. Now, what's unique about him is he distinguishes himself from a young age to such a degree intellectually that they're willing to pay for him just to learn on his own. Now, that might seem today, when you have places like Bnei Brak or Lakewood, which we know of, in which whole cities are supported by father-in-laws. The whole state of Israel is supported by a father, and the whole state of Israel has become a father-in-law. That actually was quite unique in the 18th century. To have somebody who would just be paid to sit and learn all day was actually a unique phenomenon. And Elijah Vilna distinguishes himself to the point that he's allowed to do that. Now, he eventually is given a klois, a little place to learn, right in the middle of the Jewish quarter. And there develops around him a certain kind of cult of brilliance, of genius. And you can imagine there are no movies, there are no shows, there's no TV. I know Jeremy likes to watch all. He's a TV watcher. That's when true. He's not reading a book, he's flicking. There's no TV, no movies, no Shalom Aleichem yet. And basically what you have is you've got a person like the Vilna Gaon sitting there, and people begin to peer into his room. People begin to try to look at him, see him. There's a kind of cult, a charismatic personality.
And let's talk a little bit about the development of that cult of personality, because as you're saying, one of the things that he really is known for is almost this kind of inhuman degree of attention and effort. Certainly there were not the distractions that you and I might face every day, or perhaps maybe I just face. But there certainly were ways of spending your time that didn't involve putting your nose into a safer every day. What was it about the Vilna Gaon? You've already identified this kind of confidence that comes from living in Vilna, this town, and also from the support. But what was it about him that really sort of made people want to look in and watch him do what he did?
So first of all, I think it's very surprising. There are a number of rabbis that are spoken about in hagiographic terms for their incredible memory. And Elijah of Vilna certainly had a great memory, but you never see it discussed, his photographic memory. That's not, nowhere is it discussed that he was born a genius. What is described it's almost like, a little bit like reading some of Malcolm Gladwell's books recently. The kind of discipline, the kind of effort, the kind of passion, drive, and support by people around him that it would take to produce this intellectual phenom. And not only just this intellectual phenom, but remember, this is a person who commented on more texts, more classical Jewish texts, than anyone in the annals of Jewish history. And what they describe is not someone who was born with these talents, but rather somebody who disciplined themselves to be able to achieve that. And it was nicely, pithily summarized in a kind of term that parents ended up telling their kids in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, which was Vilna Gaon. Only if you will it, playing off the term Vilna, only if you will it can you be a genius. That genius is something not that you're born with, but something that you have to produce, that you are in charge of to become.
Which is a little different, because often when we think about sort of this period of developing the cult of genius and in the decades after, it's something that's almost a gift of God. It's sort of very natural, and this is what you're saying is exactly the opposite of the case. How did this sort of affect kind of the Jews around the Jews after you started talking about this? How did this affect their idea of what an intellectual achievement can be?
Okay, you have to understand, 19th century is an age that universities are emerging, and you're finally having people from various economic sectors of society enter into higher educational institutions. And the idea of what constitutes valid knowledge is not just something that's in the domain of elites, but really something also that is publicly being discussed. And there is no more deformed, no more mocked, no more degraded form of knowledge than rabbinics. This is the age that rabbinics takes its hardest hit. This is an age that reason is being marshaled as a mantra for all of Western life. There are people who are irrational, and there are people who are rational. And rabbinics are something that is irrational. What becomes unique about the Vilna Gaon's legacy is, today the pupil comes out, it says 94% of Jews feel prideful about their Judaism. Let me tell you something. That's a very new thing. For many years, a lot of Jews didn't feel so prideful about their Judaism. And so what happened in the 19th century was the Vilna Gaon and what he represented, this idea of Talmudic genius, not just Talmudic, a rabbinic genius, someone that mastered all of rabbinic knowledge in what was constituted as the 7 sciences in the 18th century, becomes a beacon, becomes a point of pride, becomes the most popular picture in Lithuania. And he becomes a symbol that the Jewish mind is not something that is deformed, but that is something that is great. And that the project of rabbinics ultimately is not something that should be dismissed, but is something that there is genius within.
I want to follow up on that because, as you say, sort of the Vilna Gaon's intellectual achievements were exemplified in the form of commentary, this very old and traditional format, right? But on the one hand, here he was someone who wrote a commentary. It wasn't like Rashi that everybody was reading. Here was a commentary that very, very few people were able to, in fact, that's one of the achievements of the book. One of the very few people are ever able to understand what this commentary is. How did that affect his genius? And in certain ways, maybe you can talk about how radical his commentaries were. This is, again, a point that you make in the book. They're not traditional in some sense, even though he's held up as a traditional individual in many ways.
Okay, guys, this is going to be a long answer. It's going to be a long one, and you're going to have to pay attention carefully. But there's a payoff. Let me start. There's two sides to the legacy. One is the popular legacy. One is the intellectual legacy. They don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, but they're both important to understand because you don't get to the popular one without first the intellectual one. Let me first tell you the popular one. The popular one is best, I think, summarized in a conversation I had with Harold Bloom. After I got my PhD and I went to Oxford, I got a job at Yale, and one of the first things that was asked of me was to go speak to the Oracle, to the great Harold Bloom. He wanted to know more about the Vilna Gaon. I was invited. Moshe Idel, the great Kabbalist scholar, told me that Bloom wanted to know more about it. Bloom, by the way, is one of the great literary critics of the 20th century. And I go to meet with him, and Bloom says to me, Ellie, I want you to, it's not Ellie, it's dear boy. Dear boy, tell me, I only know this idea of genius. That's what's been emblazed in my mind since a young boy, the man who wrote the book called Genius. But I don't know what he wrote. What did he write? And I said to him at that moment, I go, no, you nailed it. The most important thing is that there is the idea of genius. In an age in which Jews are using intellectual achievement as a means towards upward social mobility, the idea of there being a genius is something critical. That's the first half of the legacy, the popular. Now, this one's the more complicated one. What's actually written, which nobody can read? So I'm going to give you guys one little example to try to explain it. On the holidays, every single holiday, you go to synagogue. Synagogues tend to read from the various books of the prophets. So the books that they read are often, there are 5 Megillot that are read. The Megillah of Ruth, or Eicha, Lamentations. They're read on the different holidays. And one of them is the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. But it's a kind of controversial book if you read Kohelet, right? It's a little bit sketchy, because it kind of calls, theologically speaking, kind of calls into question a lot of things. And so when it was read in the holidays, traditionally, there wasn't a blessing made on that book. Never blessing made. All the other ones got a blessing. Kohelet didn't. And if you will go to if you were in an Eastern European synagogue, never would you ever say a blessing on it. And there are long folios upon folios justifying why one would not say a blessing on Kohelet. The Vilna Gaon, his commentary in Jewish law, says it's maybe only 10 words. He says as follows. I'm going to unpack them. He says, Kohelet, make the hands impure, number 1. 3-4 words, quoting a Talmudic passage. And see Tractate Sofrim, page X. Maybe 10, 12 words. That's it. They're folios upon folios, and therefore we read it with a blessing. Folios upon folios written about this that one doesn't. This is 12 words. What does that mean? So if you go and you look at these various little hints, they're like little codes. It's almost written like a code, a mathematical code. You look at the hint. He sends you, it doesn't make the hands impure. What that is, it's a reference to a Talmudic discussion in which it says that Kohelet was supposed to be treated as a canonical work. What it meant by not making the hands impure was that traditionally, it made the hands impure. It made the hands impure because then you wouldn't put the book next to consecrated food, because if you put the book next to consecrated food, guess what happened? Mice would come and it would eat up the pages of the book. So if you said that the book itself makes the hands impure, you wouldn't put that book next to consecrated food, which made the book canonical. So number one, Ecclesiastes is canonical. The second thing he says then is go look at Masechet Sofrim. In Tractate Sofrim, rabbinic work, it says that one should read all the 5 different Megillot on the holidays. In other words, saying that they all should be equally treated. So what is he doing? He's saying, wait 1 second. The reason why you're not making a blessing on this is for some reason you don't think this work is canonical. I'm telling you this book is canonical, and it should be treated like all those other books, and therefore, one should disregard 300 years of Jewish practice, 400 years of Jewish practice, what you all do in your synagogues every single day, and you should be reading it. Now that's all done. Here's the key. That's all done in about 10 words. That is an economy of language.
And it also, I think, gave the impression of people saying, well, I can't possibly understand this. It must be brilliant. Right?
Okay.
I mean, it was. Perhaps,
2 things.
But...
Well, what it did was there were 2 tracks. One was the Cult of Genius, and that was created in the pictures, most popular picture, hagiographies. And then there were the commentaries that were studied by elite sectors of society. And the 2 were different tracks.
And I want to get back to this thing that you said about, in 12 words, overturning 300 years of tradition. One of the things that often now we think about this Vilna Gaon is someone who is a representative of the traditional world. But that sounds pretty radical to me, right? So, you talk about the Vilna Gaon, the making of modern Judaism. I mean, is he a modern guy? This sounds modern to me.
Well, what does impure hands have to do with modernity and blessings at synagogue? What does any of this content have to do with modernity? Somebody asked me this the other day, and I said to them, the content, it's not about the content. It's not about the content. It's about the relationship, and it's about the method. It's the posture that you have to everything that came before you. The posture you have. How do you deal with what came before you? Does it claim you and prevent you from being the person or stating the things that you believe are correct? Or does it impinge and prevent you from expressing yourself? Okay, now we're talking more modern. Now what's going to happen is that, they're going to be traditionalists, they're going to follow the content. There are going to be many traditionalists that are going to try to follow the content. But then there are going to be enlighteners. And those enlighteners are going to adopt the method. And they're going to say, it's not about the content. People like Moses Lilienblum, the founder of Chibat Zion, the first Zionist movement, Peretz Smolenskin, all the way down to Abraham Kahan, great Yiddish forwards editor, will also claim the Vilna Gaon. Until, by the way, 1870, there is not one Jewish enlightener who does not claim his legacy. And what they claim is none of the content. They claim the ability to challenge the last 1,000 years of Jewish life.
So let me ask you this. What would the Vilna Gaon have said about the people who, stand in his way, who claim his legacy in that respect?
In both respects, or which respect?
Well, the respect of saying that we can change, it's a good question, to change the tradition, right? What would he have said,
Okay, great question, $1 million question. What does it mean, right? So, the Vilna Gaon himself, it's not clear he ever practiced what he preached. In other words, he wrote these commentaries, but he practiced whatever the custom was in Vilna. Okay? He himself tells his students to go to the Holy Land, to Palestine, but he never makes it past Amsterdam. You could talk a big game, but ultimately he himself never pulled it off. Now, his students in 1809, Menachem Mendel of Shklov and Yisrael of Shklov and Sadia ben Natanata, will act on those ideas and say, goodbye 1,000 years of Jewish life. We're making our way to Jerusalem, not just up to Safed, but all the way down to Jerusalem. And we're going to go reclaim a long-forgotten legacy. Now, I think there he probably would have been supportive. What would he say to a Maskil today? I don't know what he would think of us, Jeremy. I can't say straight-faced that he would be enamored with either of us.
Certainly not me.
Maybe certainly not me. Right, okay.
And
He might even put us in a pillory.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly possible. But to be put in a pillory by the Vilna Gaon, that
Exactly.
would be great.
If only my book was being burned today. I know, yes.
I guess that also gets to this question of Vilna. I want to return to Vilna. That this was in some ways a bastion of self-confidence for him, right? It was a place of great. But I guess what you're raising the question of is it also a cocoon? Is it a place that, or is it a cage in a certain kind of way? Does it prevent him from going out and being in the world? What kind of leader? I get into the question of what kind of leader he was. He was certainly an influence. He was a shining star, right? But did he? You talk about this some in the book. What interaction does he have with the outside world if, even as you're saying, he's not necessarily going to be interested in practicing what he preaches?
Let's first talk cocoons.
Yeah.
There's a whole boogeyman called the ghetto. So tell me something. Why do all of you live around Jews? When Eastern European Jews come to America, there's a lot of places for them to live. And yet somehow, not Western European Jews, but Eastern European Jews, on their own end up living around other Jews. Now, this remains. You see New York, certain pockets. So first of all...
I feel like we're getting back to the Pew study.
So again, we got to get to the Pew study. We got to get to the Pew study at some point. But there's a real fundamental difference between living as a minority and living in somewhere like Western Europe or Berlin, where you're living 2,000 Jews of 100,000 inhabitants, versus living in Vilna, 10,000 Jews of 20,000 inhabitants. What your texts are, what your language is, the centripetal force that's going to be pulling back to what it is that your community values is radically different than a certain acculturationist push that is going to end up emerging in Western Europe. And also the literary products, the intellectual products. What Moses Mendelssohn is going to produce is going to be something very different than Elijah of Vilna produced, not because Moses Mendelssohn had a better brain than Elijah of Vilna did, but simply our surroundings affect us. Now, Elijah of Vilna, what's kind of interesting is just the degree to which how little he had to do with the community around him, which is one of the great ironies. But you know what? I mean, we see this also. When you look at Einstein's hair and the tongue, what's the statement that Einstein's making with the hair and the tongue? Gilles Deleuze, what was it? The nails, right? What's the statement there? The statement is that this person is different. And there is something important about that difference. And we as a community need to be careful never, we as Americans, we as Jews, we as human beings, need to always distinguish between Gaonut, genius, and Menschlichkeit. They are not the same things. Being a mensch is one thing, being a genius is another. And you know what? It's not clear to me. We should all tell our kids to be Gaonim.
I mean, one of the things that's very sort of striking in the book is the depiction of the Gaon as, I would say the phrase a family man, but it's almost the exact opposite of a family. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, he did have a family. He does live in the world, but he doesn't live in the world at the same time, right?
He certainly is a family man, has a number of kids. But what kind of family man? Now, his children tell us. This isn't stories. His children tell us. I'll tell one quick story here that his son Avram and Yehuda Leib tell in the introduction to his commentary to Caro's Code. You can open it up. It's a commentary printed at the beginning of the 19th century. They say it right there. They say, When our younger brother, we had a younger brother who the Gaon really, really loved him more than all of us, he felt deeply ill. But our father was going to go off into the woods to study. And, his studies simply came first. And so he packed up, went off into the woods, and spent a month there, and never once thought about us or anything to do with my brother. One day, he was on the toilet, if you will. And it's only at those moments that one can't think about Torah. And he remembered my brother. And he said, "Oh, I wonder how he's doing." And picked himself up and then went back home. That's a father? That's a father? So, and they tell that story. Not only that, the grandkids say that I was in Vilna for months. And he never even sought me out to say hello, to ask me about my family, to ask me about my life. So what you see there is you see that there are serious costs to this personality. You want to produce more text? You want to write more text than anyone in the annals of Jewish history? You want to be a Steve Jobs? You want to be an Albert Einstein? Don't ever confuse that with being a good family man or a good human being. And I think, unfortunately, in our society, we put such a premium, and I think Jews as a whole put such a premium on intellectual excellence that we sometimes don't realize that you don't always get your cake and eat it too. And we got to think, what do we really want to be teaching our children?
And I think, you're getting to this question of whether or not Elijah of Vilna himself, wanted his example to be, or thought that his example should be one that was universalizable or something. Whether or not, in some sense, all of these people who said Vilna Gaon, misunderstood in certain ways the Gaon's legacy. I'm wondering, in other words, this sort of very radical editing and this radical commentary positions. Again, the Gaon might not have wanted people to have done this. It was fine for him because he was a genius, but maybe not for everyone else.
Chaim of Volozhin shuts it down. Mm-hmm. Chaim of Volozhin shuts it down, and with that, we begin to see also a split in modern Judaism. There are going to be those, the enlighteners, who will claim it, the method, the approach. And there are going to be traditionalists like Chaim of Volozhin who say that might have been good for the Gaon of Vilna, but not for what's going to end up becoming a yeshiva community. And as time goes on in the 19th century, those two communities begin to grow further and further apart. They all continue to claim the Gaon. They all continue to claim the Gaon. You will have Zionists, Yiddishists. Benjamin Harshav, to this day, claims himself as a disciple of the Vilna Gaon. But in the traditionalist community, they will be very clear that that approach will not be the one that they will take into modernity. And so while the rifts grow and the various different religious approaches in modern life grow, they'll all claim the Gaon for very, very different reasons.
I want to also talk about one way in which people are, in modern Judaism, are struggling with an issue that the Gaon took on and that people claimed that the Gaon took on, which was the way he incorporated non-Jewish subjects, particularly philosophy and others, into his work. The Gaon comes up with a very, there's a very complicated question. You handle this, I think, very nicely in the book, about the ways in which the Gaon did know philosophy, he used, he didn't use. And in some ways, this question of what is the place for Jewish knowledge and secular knowledge, that's the question of modern Judaism in some ways entire. So, what are some of the ways the Gaon dealt with this, and how do people understand or misunderstand him in this way?
Jeremy, that remained the issue up until the Pew poll.
Okay.
The issue of secular knowledge and Jewish knowledge for modern Jews is no longer an important category.
So it had a good run, but it's...
That category was... That issue was why you saw the first half of the 20th century, up until maybe 20, 30 years ago, if you taught Jewish studies in any capacity in a university, chances are, if I gave you one figure, trust me, it's not the Vilna Gaon. If you were studying Jewish studies in university and it wasn't the Bible, you tell me the figure who you would have studied. Because Maimonides embodied that tension between a secular world of philosophy and some kind of other religious commitment. And the question of trying to mediate those two worlds together. The reason why you're seeing today, by the way, in the academy, there are very few in the American Academy Maimonides scholars. What you're seeing is, you see a whole range of various different, you see a whole emergence of the study of Eastern Europe, Hasidism. You see an embrace of rabbinics that is emerging, of textuality. And you're seeing Israel studies all over the place cropping up. Forget the Holocaust studies for a moment. This has nothing to do, though, with the tension of am I secular, am I religious? Am I Jewish or am I American? Am I Russian or am I a Jew? What the Pew poll tells you is that struggle has largely ended, for better or for worse. You have 58% of Jews who are intermarried, who don't see their Americanness and Jewishness as being in tension. And you have largely an increasing Orthodox community that feels very much at home living a world apart. Now, what that shares in common with the world of the Vilna Gaon, right? How am I going to get this back to the Vilna Gaon? Is if there's one thing that I see in common with Eastern European pre-acculturation society and post-acculturation America is that neither one are particularly bothered by the question of acculturation. And so when I look at the most dynamic today, the most dynamic elements of religious identity, I'm talking religious identity for Jews, those who identify with Judaism in some kind of religious vein, I see three things. I see, number one, Israel has turned into a kind of religious identity. You go to AIPAC conference, there's davening going on there, there's services, there's kosher food. The kind of neo-spirituality, the replacement of cantors and organs with strumming folk singers and Carlebach, and the kind of textuality that you can see in a Hadar or Limud or in Lakewood or B'nai Brak. Those three things, textuality, spirituality, and Zionism, the first chapter of that story is not to be found in Western Europe with Moses Mendelssohn. You can get to Reform Judaism. You can maybe get to conservative and Orthodox Judaism out of Reform Judaism. You can get to, out of Moses Mendelssohn and 18th century Germany and a minority Jewish community living there. You could get anti-Semitism. You can get the various struggles with acculturation and emancipation and religious reform. But you can't get neo-spirituality, you can't get the textuality, and you can't get the Zionism that you see today in American Jewry. That comes from a totally different genealogy.
And without sort of getting into a lot of inside baseball, I think one of the real achievements of the book is really to create a kind of story of Jewish modernity that really is not located, as so many of the previous generations' stories are, in Western Europe as the paradigmatic model, but really from this kind of Eastern European landscape that you're talking about. I want to focus on one element of what you've just said to again sort of go back and complicate the story of the Vilna Gaon in the way that you do, right, which is about spirituality and especially about Hasidism, which you've also mentioned, right? One of the things we all sort of grew up sort of hearing to these was, you have Hasidism, right, and there's this new movement, and the Vilna Gaon is sort of this implacable opponent of Hasidic life, and these two things are very far apart, and he's the rationalist, the arch-rationalist. I think, you give a more complicated picture in the book of all of this, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, this is one of his failures. This is one of the great failures. By failures, I mean to say, not that intellectually the fight wasn't important. The fight intellectually actually was an important one. But socially, he failed. He failed because he lost. He tries to take this dynamic, new spiritual movement, and he tries to put its leaders in pillories. He tries to excommunicate its followers, and he fails at it. The reason why he fails is, by the way, he fails because the conditions of modernity and the rise of the state allow for the freedoms of various religious groups. And the Russian state and even the weak Polish state is not going to tolerate him putting people in pillories. And he fails. He fails. Ultimately, Hasidism flourishes in that respect. Now, intellectually, it's not clear he loses. He probably wins intellectually. Intellectually, what he says is, as opposed to putting the locus of Jewish life simply in one's spiritual ecstasy, the locus of Jewish life has to be around the idea of study. Now, ultimately, by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Hasidism would also end up adopting Batei Midrash and Yeshivot as the central institutions even in their courts. In other words, they move from the Rebbe's court to the Beit Midrash, to the Yeshiva, to the center house of study, as opposed to, let's say, a Sabbath table with great food, as being the locus of their identities. But the way they both merge in the end is as follows. While the Hasidim will end up adopting the structures of the Beit Midrash or of the Yeshiva and put Jewish learning, or specifically rabbinic learning, front and center, the hierarchy inside of those institutions remain today Hasidic. The rabbi, the teacher, ends up becoming a kind of deified tzaddik.
Which doesn't sound so unfamiliar from our discussions of the Vilna Gaon. Here we have this charismatic figure, this kind of...
But he never would tell people about their lives. That's the difference. They'd come to me and ask a question about life. I'm not interested in your life, Jeremy. What have you read? You have problems with your wife? It's very nice. Go find a psychologist.
I just want to point out that I do not have problems with my wife. That was a hypothetical situation. But
I just saw his wife last night. She was smiling, thrilled.
That's right. Yeah.
Glowing about Jeremy.
We do have though in this picture of that you provide of the Vilna Gaon, someone who is sort of less of a brain in a box than we might have thought that he was. You mentioned him going out to the wood to sort of commune with his thoughts. We have there's an indelible image that you have, and you might want to expand on this, of Vilna Gaon in jail with toothpicks trying to hold his eyes open. Maybe you could tell us a little bit.
Because it's Sukkot, and he will only sleep in a sukkah. And he's in jail.
And that's not a story about intellectual achievement.
Yeah, there's a few times when there are politically pressing matters that he inserts himself in them. There are a few cases. One of the cases is, of course, Hasidism that we know about. The other one that very, very rarely do people ever talk about, but actually I think was just as bold and as radical, is there's a young man, the leader of a town, of let's say a UJA head, who decides Judaism is not his cup of tea, and goes and converts. There are many monasteries all over Vilna, and he goes and converts. I think in the Dominican monastery, I think. Don't quote me on it, because all the people you're going to quote to are going to be interested in that one. But he goes and he converts, and this UJA head is having none of that. And he goes and he tells the Vilna Gaon, I want to stop this. I want to go get him out of this monastery, and I want to go convert him back. And the Vilna Gaon gives his blessing on kidnapping the kid out of the monastery. The kid goes there freely. They're going to kidnap the kid, hatch a plan to make him be friends with someone, kidnap the kid, ship him off westward, and somehow this is all going to happen, and it's going to be kosher.
I have to say, you read this account, which you tell so wonderfully in the book, and genius is not the word that comes to mind.
What would you...
when you think about this plan, as you harebrained and zany.
Gutsy, harebrained. Well, not knowing... It's about having an outsized vision of what your place is in society. But again, if you're living... In other words, if you're living in a world in which 50% of the people in the town all deify you, then yeah, what I say goes. And so he gives his permission. And of course, the authorities end up eventually rounding up all the conspirators in this, among them the Vilna Gaon. Now, he's sentenced to a long time in jail, but he barely serves any of it. Barely serves any of it. How that happens, who knows? But he barely actually serves any of that time. But what that also shows is a very, very different religion. Can you imagine Moses Mendelssohn producing such an act of chutzpah? Say, okay, somebody converted to Judaism. One of my children converted to Christianity. I'm going to hire some hitman out in Warsaw, get the hitman to come become friends with her inside the monastery. This is what happened. Become friends with her in the monastery. A couple weeks later, take them out for a walk, then throw a bag on their heads, and then ship them off to Eastern Europe, and everything's going to be hunky-dory.
This is why Ellie doesn't need to watch TV, by the way, because he has these kind of stories in his back pocket. Yeah, and when the police question him, I mean, this gets back to the confidence thing that you're saying, right? He just sort of says, "I don't need to answer any of your questions," right?
Who are you?
Who are you, policeman?
That's what he basically. I mean, he says this in. It's not clear what he's saying there, but he says the little Klausner writes down some kind of jumbled statement which basically says, "Who the hell are you? I don't have to answer to any of you people." And they say, "All right, we'll throw you in jail." But in the end, he doesn't serve the whole jail time.
And this is another kind of legacy that we've been talking about, right? Is this confidence and audacity that other kinds of modern Jews might take on, not from an intellectual
chutzpah.
The chutzpah. Right?
Where does the chutzpah come from? Well, chutzpah does not come from Western Europe. Doesn't come from Moses Mendelssohn. The chutzpah comes from somewhere else. It's like, I remember reading with my mom to Nisrafim. Who's the chutzpah the way they come on the train? Right. They come on the train. They own, it's this Shalom Aleichem story where he describes the way Jews walk on the train in Eastern Europe. They own the whole train. They take over the whole thing. They're not trying to be quiet. They're talking loudly. They're engaging. Where on earth do they get off acting? You only get off acting like that if you're basically around people like you all day, and you don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Right. This is, in the trains in Shalom Aleichem, right, he says, this is the third-class compartment, right? This is where you really, the first-class compartment is Gentiles, and the second-class compartment are Jews pretending to be Gentiles. But the third class, that's where, and it's this Jewish space, right? It's this Jewish land. And that's absolutely right. Well, speaking of chutzpah, I am not only going to have the chutzpah because to stop this here, because we could go on for a long time, but we're coming to an end, and to ask Eli to answer his own questions. So those are my double chutzpah, but first I would like to ask you guys to give Eli a round of applause, please, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. Helena has the microphone, and so if people would like to raise their hands, she will do the honors.
Okay, well, the first thing is the project as a whole. There was no part of rabbinic, Talmudic, Kabbalistic, or biblical literature that he didn't touch. The idea that there is a Jewish canon. That canon is comprised of Kabbalistic, rabbinic, and biblical texts. This is something that all of his students, his son, Chaim of Volozhin, they will all remark, that there was an idea that he commented, and what he commented upon constituted Kol HaTorah Kula, all of Jewish knowledge. Now, he privileged in that space. First of all, he distinguished all three genres. The Bible could be interpreted separate than rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature could be interpreted separate than Kabbalistic literature as well. But within those three genres, the one that he ended up privileging was the attempt to understand and master rabbinic, specifically Talmudic learning. And the reason why he found that project to be so compelling was he saw the rabbis as no longer having any prophetic abilities, and only using their natural or biological resources. Logic, reason, the ability to study, to engage in an act of shaklavataria, back and forth. And that rational undertaking, that totally human undertaking of learning, not one which was prophetic or that came from Magidim, that came from angels, knowledge produced through one's own will, through one's own drive, through one's own discipline, that was the most ideal form of knowledge. And that project of learning in of itself, not getting stuff from outside forces, not being endowed from birth, or not getting ideas from dreams, but the great human project of learning and study, that was the most prized part and project of Judaism.
Thank you. Could you comment on these two ideas? One being, he seems to have amended so many texts, particularly like in the Midrashim, like Sifrei. Was it done with any research at all? And I'll let you answer that.
The emendations. Yes, I mean, I have a whole chapter on just the emendations of Midrash Halacha. Here's what I will say about the emendations. There were a lot of people in the annals of Jewish history who amended. He was not the first who amended. But the extent to which he amended and the way in which he made emendation a virtue, and part also of a larger theological process of the redemption of the rabbinic tradition, the ability to perfect the rabbinic tradition, that was unique. The idea of perfecting it, and the fact that emendation was not simply just correcting just scribal errors, but was in some ways making these texts perfect, that also had a certain theological connotations to it that I think he was expressing when he was engaged in it. And that's what scared Chaim of Volozhin also.
And only the Bible was off limits, right?
The Bible was off. So, for example, very, very simple principle. In the Bible, when two words looked the same, they were synonymous, they could never actually be synonymous. Each one had to be there for a specific reason. It wasn't just that somebody ran out of other words. Every word had a purpose. Rabbinic literature, there was synonymy all over the place. And those synonyms needed to be gotten rid of, because if you're practicing an economy of language, a perfect writer never simply repeats things over without having sufficient reason for doing so.
Not to sound disingenuous, but as far as this plan to rescue the young man from a monastery, can't it be seen as a kind of parallel to the deprogramming efforts that went on, when young Jews were often going into cults? And from the point of view of somebody like the Gaon, wasn't Christianity really just a wildly successful cult?
Well, I don't think you would view it as a wildly successful cult. It was kind of the larger world that was outside of him. That's an interesting comparison, the kind of debugging that went on in the 80s with the Hare Krishnas, and American Jews being scared of Jews for Jesus, and that kind of, maybe, I don't know enough. It's an interesting question. I never thought about the kind of fears of Christianity in Eastern Europe versus, say, Western Europe, the fears of conversion in that way. It's an interesting question. I have to think about it.
Could you please comment on the connection between Zionism and the Vilna Gaon that you mentioned? I didn't understand it.
Okay. This is a very complicated history. For the last 20 years, there's been a major, major debate in Israeli academic, secular, settlers' circles over where is the origins of Zionism. Does it start in 1880 with Moses Lilienblum, and Peretz Smolenskin, and Leon Pinsker, and the founding of Chovevei Tzion, and the secular Zionists like Eliezer ben Yehuda, who goes to Palestine before even 1880? Or does it begin in 1809 with the first Ashkenazic delegation to come back to Jerusalem in 200 years? That delegation are the students of the Vilna Gaon that go from Safed down into Jerusalem and set up the first yishuv, what's called the Old Yishuv. Settlers will end up claiming that Zionism, in its modern context, begins with the students of the Vilna Gaon and their messianic trip to the Holy Land, thinking that the Messiah might come in 1840. Or does Zionism begin in 1880 as a secular movement to be able to consolidate Jewish resources and to be able to put bread on people's tables and solve people's materialistic problems, and to be able to sew back together a cohesive Jewish body politic? Does it begin there in 1880 or 1881? Or does it begin in 1809? Now, the interesting thing is that those in 1880, like Pinsker, like Lilienblum, like Smolenskin, will all claim the Gaon to various degrees. But they're not going to claim him because of his attempted trip to Palestine. They're not going to claim him because of any kind of messianic idea. They're going to claim him because of his idea, because of his ability, even if he would have totally disagreed with the way he was being interpreted, because of his ability to break with 1,000 years of Jewish practices and customs. The ability to say, there is something different. I have the ability to challenge what has come before me.
Did the Vilna Gaon write about the problem of agunot in his day? Did he address that problem?
The problem of agunot is largely begins in the 19th century with mobility. You need more mobility for that to happen. That's starting at the end of the 18th century. It's going to become a larger problem when Jews start going to Liverpool and Manchester for manufacturing jobs, start running away. It's going to become a greater problem when railroads begin to emerge and people can leave. When the Pale of Settlement eases up for those who are university graduates or those who are high-level merchants, and mobility ends up ripping apart families and making communication more difficult. We're still at the end of the 18th century. There is no railroad yet.
Thank you. Was he influenced at all by what was happening in France, the Age of Enlightenment, Voltaire? Some of these ideas sound very similar to what was happening.
Not that I can tell.
Okay.
Not that it's a great question. It's a great question. Not that I can tell. And that's, you should know, that's a part of the story itself that I'm trying to tell here, which is not every great Jewish idea came from someone who wasn't Jewish. Not every single one. Yeah.
Including that idea.
Could you comment on the Vilna Gaon's family, his father, etc., and particularly, who was his Rebbe?
Great questions. We have no idea who his Rebbe was, and that's part of the legacy itself. There is no real Rebbe. He didn't have a Rebbe. The Haredi world today says, oh, someone has to have a legacy, has to have a Masorah, has to have a kind of a tradition. A lot of them critique someone like Adin Steinsaltz. Who was his Rebbe, they ask. Who was the Vilna Gaon's Rebbe? It's a good question. Regarding his father, the man supposedly sat day and night and learned in Vilna. He doesn't mention him one time in his commentaries. Not one thing from his father. Talk about an anxiety of influence.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. Did you have a question?
Do we have any piece of wisdom, existential or spiritual insights that we can ascribe to him? Or he was just purely cerebral, detached?
You're asking a $1 million question. You're asking the question, okay, so what's the great idea there? What did he have an idea? An E equals MC square. Listening to Beethoven, you could tell, you could hear the genius. Look, for some Orthodox people, I'm sure there are many, the content of his interpretations on Zra'im, on Tarot, on Kiddushim, on Gittin, on all these tractates, for some of them, I'm sure that content in and of itself is very important. For secular Jews, for the world that I live in, the academy, I don't see in those Wortlach anything terribly profound in the content itself. But the approach, the method, and what that came to symbolize for Jewish life is as profound of an idea as any other. The ability and the greatness of one's own intellectual capacities and the idea of intellectual achievement as a means towards upward social mobility and the ability not to be cowed or to be fearful of those around you, but to say what you really believe and what you think is right and what is just. Those are important values. And they're more important to me than any of the comments or content of Zra'im or Kudshim. To me, that idea of there being an importance for the human being, the individual, to be able to engage in a great intellectual project and to be able to be part of a great intellectual project and to feel proud of that intellectual project. What more important idea is there than that?
I think we're going to take one more question.
Thank you. Was there any knowledge of Spinoza at the Gaon? Any information that you found?
Great question. Spinoza does not come back. Remember, even Mendelssohn is still trying to distance himself at all costs from Spinoza. Spinoza doesn't, even Germany, doesn't get play until the 19th century. Now, it happens to be, there's an interesting book recently written that showed in Eastern Europe, when Spinoza does emerge in Eastern European writing, there isn't any of the baggage that happens in Western Europe where you're being tarred as a heretic, because it's kind of so far away from you that you don't feel threatened by it in the same way. And that's one of the interesting things about the Gaon. In other words, a lot of the reason why he can precisely express these things is because he's not being threatened. He's not in an environment or in a culture that's calling into question the knowledge that he privileges. So eventually there will be those in Eastern Europe that, coming from that vantage point, will end up adopting Spinoza. But the Gaon, from what I can gather, I have not seen any data that could show we knew anything about that.
I think you can see how monumental the task that Eli had before him to create a portrait of a figure who has been disguised by centuries of a legacy that may not be exactly what he himself was, who ended up with his own mystification and was a complicated and knotty personality, and beyond that, continued to write in language and on topics that were almost inscrutable to the vast majority of people who followed him. I think you can see how ably Eli handled the task and how interestingly and wonderfully he rose to the occasion. If you want to see even more of that, and I encourage you to do so, he will be selling books and signing them right after this.
He will also be selling his book and signing. So, and I encourage you, if you want to understand what it means, in this Pew poll that they said, 45% of Jews say that the most important thing about their Jewish identity is humor. Forget the Vilna Gaon. It's a humorless test. Go study Shalom Aleichem.
Well, thank you all for your time and for your attention.